Hello, everybody. My name is Michelle from OG Rose. I'm so excited to have Thomas Jockin and Javier Rivera here with us today. And we're going to jump into a topic that we've all been discussing with each other, kind of generated by the question of virtual ethics. And so I'm not going to go ahead and jump right into our terminology just yet, but I'm really excited about it. And I think this will be a great kind of verbal session for us to kind of dig further into what we've been discussing and hash out some other things as well. So yeah, very excited to have you guys with me today, and yeah, definitely friends of the channel. And so yeah, we're talking about virtual ethics, and also the way in which the ethical appears in the virtual and also in physical spaces and how those relate to each other. Does anyone want to kick it off with something? If not, I can also just jump into some of our terminology. So yeah, thanks again.
No, of course, it's always good to be here, Michelle. So I think I'm gonna nominate Javier to give the context, as he was the initiator of this entire discourse, of providing the context of why we're having this discussion in the first place, and then I can jump in with secondary points.
Yeah, so Jockin's got me reading Aristotle. That's really that's really what threw this into a lot of curiosity. So this idea of, well, at first my idea was, okay, how do we apply Aristotelian virtue ethics to the virtual space? And what does that look like? Because it's not really clear what that looks like. And then I think Jockin sort of helped me refine that question a little bit more. Um, and yeah, it's this is where we're at, right? Like just trying to think like what that looks like. And then we're starting to kind of conclude that there isn't really um any ethics in the virtual space, if any. Um, so yeah, I'll pass it to Jockin on that.
To fill in the gap, the details of that. So the way this started was Javier was in reading Nicomachean in Ethics on the section on liberality, and asked the point blank question: how does liberality apply to the virtual spaces? And then talking through that, and in particular the issue of what kind of transactions of goods would be possible in a virtual space that would be virtuous, excuse me. And the problem was the idea of algorithms with subscriber counts and subscribing. This seems to be converting a human attention to like its capital. And thus, this doesn't seem like it to operate. It's something felt not right. And that led to I'm not sure how Michelle got spawned into this. She can certainly reply after I'm done replying, add her side of the story, why she's interested. But talking through this, we realized that the reason why virtue has such a hard difficulty with the virtual is because there's something at core about the human experience in the digital space that seems to be in contention to what virtue ethics is trying to point to or orient towards. Now, through the discourse of the group, we started talking through qualitatively things that were thriving, beneficial, growth, healthy, and then talking about the things that are antithesis to that qualitatively. And then we saw actually what was first originally a question of virtual versus like how to be virtuous in a virtual space also mapped onto physical spaces. But we'll talk more about that in a minute because that led to this kind of language articulation we developed. But this is just the preamble of setting up that Javier was reading Nicomachean Ethics. He ran into a big problem of translating that into the virtual space. Just like at Stumping Ground, he presented an essay about courage, again, not being able to map on to the modern world. And that led to a realization that there's a qualitative break that needed to be talked through. And that's what we did as a group. So now, Michelle, how did you get involved in this shenanigans?
I think it was because I kept on asking you at Stumping Grounds. I kept on talking to you, Jockin, about virtual. Like I was talking about the virtue and virtual. Remember, I think I asked you maybe once or twice
Yes.
about that. And so I was kind of, I think you knew I was sort of interested in that. And so maybe when you and Javier were talking, you brought that up because the way that Javier started it was like, hey, I heard you're kind of interested in that. Let's discuss, right? Like, let's talk about it. So I think that's how I did get pulled in, which happily pulled into the discussion. And yeah, as you guys were talking, I was thinking about how it's interesting because the virtual spaces and the digital kind of have to rely on the explicit. Um, because there's and so because of that there's like no there's it's interesting, it's kind of a maybe it's you could call it an irony where it's very explicit in the sense that you have no implicit, there's no implicit code of ethics, right? With the digital and the technological, it won't tell you what its ethics are, right? It just is the case. It's just, it doesn't, like, for example, it won't tell you when to stop scrolling on a phone or whatever. It's not going to tell you that. So there's nothing that's implicit. I mean, I don't know, there could be some challenge to that, but I want to say that it's difficult to know the implicit code or the etiquette, right? You start to form a kind of etiquette that you see kind of the dynamic of how people engage with each other, but it's not always very clear what etiquette looks like in the virtual spaces. Like, for very common example that I want to think about is when you're talking to somebody in like a volley, right? You're volleying back and forth in like a message, and then suddenly someone goes to like one of those people goes off. Should they say bye? Should they say, oh, thanks for chatting, I'm gonna head out? Or do you just leave it and just come back to it later because that's kind of the way you can engage in those spaces? I typically would be like, I used to would be like, oh, and it depends on the person who I'm talking to, but I'll be like, hey, thanks so much for chatting, I got to go do this thing, right? But then there's some people, like with you guys probably, I don't do that, right? Like I don't say like, oh, thanks, I'm gonna go do this now, because it's just this kind of open space that you jump in and out of. But like that's an etiquette thing that's not implicitly created by the space. And because the only thing that can ever be sort of said or stated or seen is like something that's a little bit more explicit. And so I don't mean that in like an explicit, like mature content, though that does have to do with our topic. But I'm just saying that there's there's not the explicit code for what ethics are in the virtual. And I think it's also because maybe there is none of that because there's also a ungrounded core of that for everybody. Like there's this thing that makes everything common for people. Everybody can access it, for example, right? Or anyone who can access the internet, which is most people these days, most people. So there's something that kind of is a common core to that, but there's no real sense of what the etiquette should be for those spaces. How you should, does it mean a person's upset if they read your message but they didn't respond? Da 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 da. Like all those things kind of come up. And so I was just thinking about the fact that you're saying there's no ethics in the virtual. And maybe the question is just, for me, it makes me think about like, how do you do that in a place where you can't have an implicit ground together beyond the internet itself? Like the implicit ground, I guess, is that you have the internet, but there's no sense of like what that should mean. Now you start to get shoulds as you engage with those platforms, right? You start to see people do certain things, and so then you realize, oh, okay, it's okay to not say, hey guys, I gotta go, before you jump out of the chat box or whatever, so you start to learn things. So I guess there is a culture that's developed there because so in a way, maybe there is something but I don't know that those would be ethics that are forming per se. They're more just like habits or sort of things that people tend to do in those spaces. So anyways, those are the things that were coming to mind, kind of the concept of the explicit, implicit. And I want to loop this in to sort of be able to allow us to give a gateway to our terminology we're talking about. When we were talking, I was also thinking about that conversation we sort of like, Javier, you shared to us from Guy Senstock and Jordan Allen, who's starting kind of a competitive social media called Trust Up or something
Yep.
like that.
Mhm. Yeah, Uptrust.
Yeah, thanks. And he wants to kind of use algorithmic patterning for like drawing out the best of humans, right? Not the worst, not the clickbait and the dopamine and the just kind of addictive behaviors with it. He's like, let's use addiction for good, almost. I mean, he didn't say that. He did not say that, but it does seem like he's trying to say, let's use the algorithmic for for benefiting humans, for connecting humans, for creating spaces where people actually have encountered difference and really have like conversations that are beyond just the hot topic terms and binaries and stuff like that. So yeah, so it made me think about like the term that we've been talking about with Geopadia, which would be like, for me, it made me think that he's trying to create a social media that could like afford more of the movement towards sort of a geopadic conversations. And I don't know, maybe I'll leave it to one of you guys to define it, but I'll leave it there. Thanks for letting me share on all of that. It's a little bit of a spread, but do with that what you will.
Yeah. And I mean, to build on this, I mean, actually, Javier, do you want to give a comment, a reply first before I jump in?
Um, oh geez. So I'll let you address the Geopadia part because I feel like you'll probably give a better definition. Um, but what Michelle was saying with, this idea of trying to cater it towards more human connection, the algorithm and stuff. I mean, just like what stands out to me between explicit and implicit, what you're saying, Michelle, is I noticed that a lot of the ethics concerning technology is usually like a kind of like, and this is the blind spot. It's like a given. It's like we're gonna treat this the way we treat, just be nice to people. Don't, it's like the kind of standard ethics like a parent might teach a child how to navigate the internet. Just like don't get on anything dangerous, don't watch anything you're not supposed to watch. So what's interesting is that the ethical space they think should mimic the virtual space. But that is just more like I don't know how to explain it. It's just more like yeah, they treat it like a regular space, essentially. They treat it like a normal, like just regular space that your kid would enter to, right? Don't touch these things, don't look at these things, be careful with this, don't talk to strangers. But once we get older, it just sort of just devolves into, well, I'm grown enough now, and I follow the same rules the way I treat people. But there is something significant, I would say, that's a little bit different about the virtual space, precisely because it is algorithmic that we don't take into consideration. And then now I'll go
And
to
now we'll
Jockin.
segue over. Because by the way, because what's going on is that, by the way, because me and Michelle have had conversations for almost 2 years now, that actually, ironically, I went back and re-listened to those interviews or discussions. And we were actually talking about this phenomenon that we didn't have a name for. Because what's being hinted at is that basically the world is algorithmic. And it's almost like we basically have not realized that we're captured by it. And we think that everything is algorithmic. And because we don't have a contrary word to point to what would be its opposite or contrary. So thus, by not having a name to it, we cannot point to what this phenomenon is. We just have this grasping kind of sense of like something's missing. This is not the totality of what our lives could be like. Because ethics is not just a kind of deontological stamp down of applying a rule set down. Actually, that very thought process that's what ethics is algorithmic. If I just know the rule set and just apply it in all cases, I will be good. That's actually part of the point, is that Aristotle's point of ethics is not about that, not necessarily in itself totally. It's more of way of being, in terms of by being a certain way, we open doors of possibility of how we might know ourselves, interact with others, and realize our activity. And that leads to part of the point here. So what we did, what happened was we were sitting here and going, for example, and this is partly why this is important, even though we're circling around virtual dynamics, what I introduced to the discussion was, guys, this is in physical spaces too. Let us give an example. So for example, recently there was an invite-only conference at the Gardner Farm called the Stumping Ground. It brought in multiple different camps of online spaces together, and it was 3 days of philosophical fireworks. It was very intellectually stimulating. It had a kind of a vitalness of activity and thought and discourse and thinking with contention. There were some significant contentions in the group. sometimes explicitly directly addressed, sometimes referenced but not directly addressed. But either way, the point was this was so, and as I commented in the group, guys, let's compare that experience or even something analogous like the net, for example. Let's compare those experiences to an online university course on philosophy. As anyone who knows those references acknowledges there is a qualitative phenomenon difference of those kinds of spaces, both in physical and online. Another example, by the way, the net versus Twitter. Like, try doing philosophical discourse on Twitter versus the net. You're going to see a wildly different qualitative experience. But yet we don't have a name. So thus, in the group, we kind of sat there and I was like, well, one of the ways you can do this is let's talk through the pattern of qualities and then use the names that we do know exist and then inference from that to draw it out. So we observed the general trend in all these procedures, these spaces where it had I don't want to say bad experience totally, but the different experience, the Twitter experience, the university classroom, any space where there's an algorithmic present, either explicitly in the sense of computer doing an algorithm operating, or in a classroom, there's a preset knowledge base of interaction. There's a known content source. There is a specific mode of exchange that is only intelligible under one mode of a discourse. So thus student-teacher dynamics, the class where the readings are this, you write your essays, the professor grades the essays, he gives a lecture in the front, the students are taking notes. This is all algorithmic because it has a very set pattern that tends to have, again, more drawing out. These are qualities. We're trying to draw out qualities. We tend to notice that the algorithmic, you get the same phenomenon even if you replace the widgets inside. So meaning that you can replace a professor for another professor or the student for another student, and you would actually get the same result. Scientific method operates this way too, by the way. The idea that the subjectivities or the particularities of the observance or the people doing the experiment should not matter. You should be able to reproduce the exact same result with a different set of phenomenon of data points and a different observer and get exactly the same result. These are all algorithmic. So obviously I almost slipped and said bad, but it's only in the sense that I slipped that up because these are some good things. That some of these algorithmic processes are outstanding. They're really good. Scientific method's awesome. We found out a lot of things from that. It was really good. But the problem was when that became we thought that was the only way to be. And any other way to live is unintelligible and completely impossible and would seem to be completely an irrational action. This is why Daniel's compensation of not the irrational versus the rational, the non-rational is a very relevant point. Obviously a little smile over there because of some events that occurred at the stumping ground related to that. This is important because then that's simply then this sets up that not just a binary choice of something that's either algorithmic or just completely irrational and has no binding. This hypothesis is that, say, if we know these qualities and these temperaments of the algorithmic, and this applies both to physical spaces and online spaces, and there's other qualities we'll talk about that came up from the discussion about the distinction, then I said, well, based on that, what could we give a name to this other phenomenon? And names are very hard, and a initial attempt that was accepted by the group was, well, the work of Daniel Garner and Michelle was on the distinction of the algebraic versus the geometric, which tends to lead to a relationship of apprehension versus reasoning, right? For example. So I said, okay, we're going to do that because that's part of algorithms. That's why that works. I could see the mapping to that. So we're going to grab the geo from geometric, and then the activity we noticed, and this comes from about the quality of the non-algorithmic, is that it has a sense of play. It has a sense of a kind, which comes from Plato and Aristotle. They cite this a lot. Music playing, for example, gymnastics, dance, choir. These are all part of the life of scholae, of the cultivation of the subject to be virtuous in the polis. So both from Plato and Aristotle, they are using this language of play to talk through what is the activities of scholae that give forth a virtuous polis and virtuous people. So, or that sense of play seemed very appropriate to be antagonistic or be in response to the rhythmic of algorithms in terms of being a set rigid pattern that just operates through in a linear process. There's more about these properties. Then once we said that and put those words together, it made it geopedic, Geopadia as a general term, or like algorithm is Geopadia and algorithmic with geopedic. So that's the language we'll use to talk about this. Once we did this, then we started working through, well, now that we're positing as a hypothesis this term with this phenomenon that's contrary to the algorithmic, what would it look like? And we went through a whole operation of different experiences and spaces where we see this distinction and realized that we were talking about this for years without having a name to it. So now I'm going to give it to the rest of the group to reflect on this.
Yeah, that was great. That was fantastic, Jockin. And if you want to jump in, Javier, don't let me, jump in line. I think that was all really great. And I think why it's, something that seems to be important and what we've been discussing is like why it matters to name it and to actually develop the concept of its the differentiation of its quality is because a lot of people don't know that there's like an alternative, right? It's just the algorithm works so well, like you're saying, and that can be for good. Like the fact that we can talk here today has a large part to do with algorithms working well, but in a way that only gets you so far, right? Like, and I think that the geopedic is so important because it offers a different option. Like there is an alternative to that. Because the risk of algorithmic working so well is because it works so well, right? Like it works so well in the sense that it'll always sort of supply the demand that you want, and it's not, and that unfortunately doesn't always cultivate the person, like you were talking about with virtue not being a top down but a bottom up type of cultivation of character that then means you do certain things over other things, right? Because of that inherent cultivation. The algorithmic is, at least in the technological sense, is often going to impede, I want to say, maybe not entirely, but it has a huge risk of impeding upon that cultivation, because because it has that, for example, the way most people think about the algorithm is what shows up on their feed, right? Like just what is shown to them by what they do, right? What's kind of interesting is that it sort of shows how the algorithm does a little bit of like this dialectical process of, oh, you do this, oh, I provide more, you do this. So it's like this, it's sort of almost, I almost want to say it's like the inverse of building ethics in the Aristotelian sense, because the other, it's like, you do this and here's more of what you're doing. But the other is like, how do I put this? I wonder, I mean, maybe challenge me on this, but it's like, okay, the concept is you because it's sort of, for me, it's based off of like a sense of knowing, right? The algorithmic, we talked about this too, Jockin, with in another conversation, where it's like algorithm often lends itself to feeling like right? Like you know what you like, and then the algorithm knows what you like, right? Whereas the Geopadia is a space of actually embracing the unknown, where it's the unveil, the UN in parentheses, as Daniel will talk a lot about, where there's the unveiling, right? And so what I'm interested in is the fact that there, again, there's this dialectical relationship between algorithm and human. But cultivating virtue in the Aristotelian sense seems to be like there's a dialectic between what you do and I don't know what's the other component, what you think, what you believe, like because there's a concept scripturally that like iron sharpens iron, right? So for me, the concept of the algorithm is like this, yes, it's sharpening. It's like this iron versus iron, because it's like the algorithm also mirrors you. So it's kind of doing some sort of sharpening, but almost just to wedge you further into like your pre-existing known fixedness, right? Whereas like in the Geopadia, it should allow this like openness to realizing that you know and you don't know, right? So you know what you want, but it's also like the concept of like, you know what you want, but you don't know what you need kind of concept. So it like opens you up to that. And so I wonder if maybe you can answer this question, this explicit question, Jockin or Javier, like on what is that kind of the back and forth with virtue that's doing that bottoms up kind of cultivation of self to become somebody who does certain things over other things. Because I do think there's like a mirrored almost, I don't want to say it's perverted is too strong of a word, but it's kind of trying to, it seems like it's trying to do the same thing in the algorithmic, but toward a fixedness versus a openness in the geopadic sense. But what is that other thing, you know, because it's like for cultivating virtue, what is that other thing that actually gets you to, I mean, I want to say thinking is a big part of it, but yeah, could somebody, do you kind of understand the question I have there? And then if you could answer that, that would be, I think, interesting for my own thought in terms of making a parallel here.
Yeah, that's good, Michelle. This is strangely enough, the first thing that comes to my mind is friendship.
Mm. Yeah.
But of course, not algorithmic friendship. Friendship in the sense of, because like if we use the same examples that Jockin gave, the net, the stomping ground, what is it about friendship that allows the human being to be surprised, to be challenged, to cultivate thinking is precisely because there are friends that are willing to challenge you on your sort of algorithmic protocol in your own thinking. Um, this is a real sense, you could say, a real sense of cultivation. Um, but it's hard to have that. It's hard to have that sense of friendship when the very thing that conducts the digital space is this algorithm. And in fact, you could get lucky enough to have a friendship like this because obviously we all encountered each other through these kind of features. Um, the interesting thing though is that you have to be able to, was it transpose or go over through the features, right? Like it's kind of like the implicit realm that you're talking about, Michelle, which is like I, for example, DM you or I send Jockin a voice message on Instagram. These are all hidden spaces that are actually ironically not captured, right? So actually these very spaces that the algorithm holds are actually potential spaces in which we could encounter something like real friendship, something like Geopadia, or the potential to have something like that. But it's still, it's still questionable as to how people use those exact spaces, right? Like the DMing and voice notes and so on. But I what I do find interesting though is that the less features something has, there is more potential to encounter this more human connection element. So for example, Zoom. Zoom just has the most barest essentials, which is just video face to face. That's like as personal as we can get. There's no algorithm involved, actually. Um, so the most minimal, the thing that makes that you made me think of, Michelle, is that because the algorithm is so set on this idea of excess, that it actually makes me think the proper response to kind of geopadic idea would be actually a kind of minimalism. Right? Because I know the virtue ethics is about, okay, yeah, you want to avoid excess, you want to avoid deficiency, but strangely enough, I think to deal with our times, I feel like everything is on the verge of excess. And so actually the proper response, the median, would actually be more on the side of deficiency. Like you'd be safer on the side of deficiency. And I think that's where the ethical virtual space navigation really starts to manifest, because it has to be more on the side of deficiency than excess, because everything else is in excess. But yeah, I'll pass it to Jockin on that.
That's a fun. Okay. Do you remember Javier, before I give my actual reply to Michelle, do you know the meme of like basically the idiot, the midwit, and the genius, like the bell curve distribution? The
Yeah, yeah,
one
yeah.
like where the idiot and the sage on the end of the bell curves are like, I just use notes. And then the midwit in the middle is just like all this crazy productivity apps. Like, no, you got to use your Notion. That's got to hook up to your Zapier, and that's got to connect to this, and that's got to connect to that. So that image instantly came to my mind uh,
Yes.
on that point. But back to Michelle's point. So actually, on your original opening statement, Michelle, about implicit and explicit, this relates to trust.
Mhm.
Algorithmic spaces delegate, offload trust to the institution, to the corporation, to the software. It's all trust is always stabilized by the exterior entity that builds the trust. So I can trust you in this relationship because of this larger structure. By the way, this also applies, and this actually what was a hot area of discussion was on sexuality in relationships. Absolutely, people treat relationships algorithmically because that's exactly how they treat it. I am safe in this relationship with you because I'm in this container called a relationship, because of marriage or whatever you want to call it. All right. So that's in contrast to geopadic spaces where it's interiority of trust. The interiority of the trust versus exteriority of trust is a huge part. What that means is that, for example, the very fact here, like, do you notice that we're not here interrupting each other? We have a certain way of not interrupting. We're not even using the hands up feature in Zoom to coordinate when we want to talk, which sometimes at a larger scale levels we have to do to mediate that. But I'm just talking through the point that there's a certain mode of discourse and way of carrying yourself that puts the basically the constraint on geopadic spaces is the virtue, the quality of the persons in the space. This is why it's not fungible. It actually matters who's in the space, in a geopadic space, because it requires the relationship and the trustworthiness of the individuals inside to allow those geopadic spaces to occur. Algorithms don't allow this for two reasons, or draw this out. Not only is it externalized trust, then the relationship to difference and surprise is completely different. I call it explosions of difference. So what happens in algorithmic spaces? Immediate destruction exit must occur immediately, or it becomes a death spiral of ad hominems, rage bait, basically aggression of different levels of intensity of how that plays out. Versus in geopadic spaces, they could easily, that's actually the most dangerous, that's the critical moment to find out if you're in an algorithm or geopadic space is when there's an explosion of difference. How does that get how does that get addressed? With the right cultivation of virtue, this is actually very important for anyone who's a modern. We could say, what does virtue ethics matter, or virtue, why it matter? It actually does matter, because there's a certain kind of being, a kind of person that can address difference that is virtuous. You have to have a certain dispositional state, a certain mode of how you manage your anxieties and fears and apprehensions, and how you carry yourself, for example, to seek to understand and to be understood, to not presume, to assume the best intents, to clarify misunderstandings, to stay with the person, not run away with the ideas. For example, these are just examples of me iterating out. There's lots of others we can talk about. Not exaggerating, telling the truth, etc. Like these things, these qualities allow for trust to be contained even under difference. So under the masterful state, and I've seen this many times at the net and other cases, where difference has presented itself, and then through the habituation of the people inside, they're able to, I call it spirate. You take the difference and we circle about it. We circle around it, and we're not attaching identity to the threat, that this difference is not a threat to us in our stabilization of our structure. It's an opportunity for insight. And that's what happens. Usually in algorithm spaces, difference is treated as a moment of exit, of either virality of separation and isolation to cut it away and break it away, or it's a complete exit. Versus algorithmic spaces is an opportunity for insight. That actually it's happened. So for example, they were accounts and stumping ground that you can see. There was like a theme of the therapeutic and the virtue ethics accounts seemed to like they were just antagonistic. They just seemed like they completely could not mesh. There were individuals in the group. We just sat there and we just thought it through a long time and talked it through together. And we had all these insights that came out of it. That's an example of geopedic experiences. And that required, but if you notice, there was no external entities that made that happen. It was an internal cultivation of the subjects that allowed that to occur. That is not an accident. And that's kind of the key that Javier hinted out, that sure, because that's the thing, culture is geopedic. The problem was that more and more as culture has been basically encroached by the algorithmic, the infrastructures that allowed the kind of the container of algorithms that allow it to stay stable and steady are starting to cause instability because they don't have a geopedic container that contain them in and to mediate them. So that's why we're sensing that discourse is getting more and more unstable and radicalized and polarized by difference because it cannot contain the difference and address it. All it can do is just present it, and then there's exit. That's the best answer. That's like the least worst answer you get. There's a lot of other ones that are much more worse. They cause basically polarization, usually grandstanding, rhetorical positionality of belittling, diminishment, othering, things like that. I think another aspect to this is related to the algorithmic. It's self-confirmation. Algorithms give you self-confirmation. Geopedic spaces, again, present you opportunities for encounter of difference. So the classic example is ChatGPT as your therapist. So instead of actually confronting difference, you just get a ChatGPT algorithm to talk to how great you are and say how really reasonable your positionality is. Let alone the algorithms of you start watching content saying that women are horrible, that MGTOW stuff starts showing up and red pill stuff starts showing up, and then you start getting the self-confirmation spiral of that's it. Every woman's a bunch of gold diggers, and there's no place for men, and no one's going to be incels. Or you can go, all men are horrible monsters. That if the future is female and everything that's male should be absolutely obliterated, and then you just get the algorithm supporting you that viewpoint. So you see, you get these silos of thought. Universities, we got this line of thought. The scientists are going to study other science and talk to other scientists, and that builds a self-confirmational spiral. So trust me, again, I just want to be very clear. This incrimination of ChatGPT, Twitter, this is to spaces to universities too. This is why they have all this accident. This is why do you see all this anxiety about ChatGPT with universities? It's because because actually at the foundation, it is the same. Because it is an algorithmic process where the encroachment of AI in the way it gets treated in ChatGPT is a legitimate challenge, because these are all just self-confirmational spirals related for knowledge, as opposed to geopedic spaces where there's a confrontation of difference and a mediation through first principles to come to holding difference together. To use, again, Hegelian language of the sublational movement. You want to talk about it that way. I think that's all my notes. Yes, because I already covered it. I actually another qualitative difference actually we saw is duration. Do you guys ever notice in algorithmic spaces, time durations are cut up, everything's chopped up into discrete units, versus spaces that are more continuous interaction, like Zoom. That's the point. This is why I'm trying. Like, my big project for this discussion, the algorithmic to geopedic, is even though the word algorithm, you think that's computer, you think that's everything. You think that's just computers, like everything's digital? No, Donald Trump is right. Everything's computer. He's absolutely correct. Because what I'm saying is, for example, think about having a disagreement over text message. Name me a time you resolved a conflict, a significant difference, and arguing with your girlfriend or boyfriend, your husband, wife, your friend over a text message exchange. Tell me. I promise you the answer is zero. There's been 0 times you resolved the conflict over text message. You always had to go to a more geopedic space, a more continuous interaction space to allow for more information, because again, text message drops information down to a very narrow band of information versus a phone call. You got voice. Now it's more continuous. And sometimes voice isn't good enough. Sometimes you need the video. So you got the face and body language added now to deal with the difference. And then you got to do it in person. So I kind of the big takeaway for me is that even though our origin point is the digital, the virtual, I use this discussion to point out that we see this. We're thinking computer to everything. Donald Trump was right. And this is basically our physical spaces as doing this way. But that language is not appropriate. The better way to talk about this is once you start seeing an algorithmic geopedic difference, you realize, oh my God, am I just going through my whole life in physical space like an algorithm? The answer is for most people is yes, because we had not even thought of the possibilities even reasonable. That's what I got.
Oh, that was so good. So many good points, Javier and Jockin. Let me see if I can address them. They may not be in like the right order. We'll see what comes of it. But I want to kind of address what you just most recently said, and then I'll go back over my notes. But Jockin, I was thinking about the fact that what's hard about algorithmic spaces is that they don't train us to even do phone calls. Like you hear about people being scared to take phone calls or make phone calls, and I think even if you say like, no, I'm not afraid, like you can feel the tension a little bit with a phone call versus a text. It's just easier to see it and read it and not have like the person's tone or if they're disappointed or whatever. And so it's hard because I think what probably happens is what you said, Jockin, where the algorithmic either has the isolation or exit. Do you think those things could be kind of the same though? Because if you just jetpack out of the situation, you're kind of isolated. You can potentially just either land yourself somewhere else or kind of isolate yourself further. I think they're related in a sense,
Yes.
but I think those are the two reactions to the algorithmic, and that's why people do like blocking, right? Like people just block somebody. And I'm like, what? Like, I'm not saying that people should not block other people. I get why it's sometimes about a safety thing, like back to like the simple cyber safety rules that Javier was talking about that, parents might teach their kids. The first time I ever heard of that concept was like cyberbullying. And I was like, what is that? Learned about this way back at AIM. But anyways, the point of the matter is, yeah, there's this people block each other and that's an exit, right? That's just cut off, just cuts the person off. No, don't even explain, don't even say like try to work it out, because you can't, like, if you have not cultivated the means by which to work things out, like on a phone call or maybe a Zoom call or in person, you just hit the exit button. It's just nope, boop, done. So it's interesting. It's always has struck me as like fascinating that people will just do that. Like, again, I understand there's a place for it, and sometimes it is just about like mental sanity and like but it's in a way it proves that the algorithmic does something to us, and it makes and that it does make us like the difference with technological algorithms, even though it does exist in real life, is that it gives us these tools by which to cut off the other person, the other, right? And you don't have to explain yourself. You're never held accountable for it. There's no real repercussions, except you may have like missed out on an opportunity to cultivate yourself, right? So that was something that was coming to mind. So, okay, back to the point. I thought that was really great, Javier, what you were saying about access and deficiency. And I was thinking though, because I do think for me, I think about like the Hegelian notion of that, like the fact that there's always a bothness. What I'm interested in is how, when I was at Stumping Grounds, something that I felt was this beautiful access where conversations could go on for long periods of time, where we weren't even like, I lost track of time. Time was just, it was like, it felt like a snap of the finger, and it had been 3 hours or 5 hours, and you're like, whoa, it's an incredible feeling, and it's a wonderful feeling. And it's quite the opposite of the excess you feel in the algorithmic, which feels really crappy, to be honest. It feels really malnourished. And this is the thing, that I think the excess of the algorithmic has the deficiency of nourishment. It actually does have a massive deficiency too. So it's playing with that. Okay, that's the bothness there in the algorithmic, and then the excess deficiency here in the Geopadia that we're trying to kind of flesh out is that you actually do strip away a lot of stuff, right? You don't have the distractions, you don't have the going here, 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 and here. It's very stripped down. Okay, and this way that's the deficiency of it. But I'm saying that in a good way. It's like simplicity or something versus deficiency or something. So it's like it has that aspect to it in its design, so that you can have the good access of very long conversations and holding attention for a while in an engaged way, not in a bored way, in an engaged way where you're like, I don't want this to stop. Oh, I guess I should get to bed. It's 3 a.m. So it's like, I think that there's an excess and deficiency happening on both sides of this, on the algorithmic and in the geopedic. And I wanted to kind of speak to that a little bit. Because I did feel like there's like, wow, excess, but in such a good way in stomping grounds or the net versus like in the algorithmic where it's like the excess is so it's like this inundation of these little bits, right? And it's just, I don't know, it's a type of stimulation. It just feels very, very different. So I wanted to say that. And what else did I want to say? Okay, let me go to my other note, my next note, self note. Okay, so when I was talking about like what's this dialectical thing, we've got the algorithm doing algorithm to self, self does something, algorithm comes to match it, and is this kind of constant, dialectical relationship to self. You called it self-confirmation, Jockin. That's a really good and accurate term for that. So, I was like, well, what is it to cultivate virtue? What is the self interfacing with to kind of do this process? But for your, it's interesting because self-confirmation, we don't know if that's good or bad, right? I think that how we're talking about it with the algorithmic is negative in the sense that it's, again, fixedness, it's like fragility, right? Whereas you want to do self-cultivation, which is anti-fragile, it is able to encounter difference, it's able to hold space, it's able to have the excess of a very lengthy conversation and hold the attention and the otherness. But yeah, I think your answer, Javier, was right. Like the virtuous friendship to me, which is, what we're talking about with Geopadia, that's the environment for your self cultivation. So it's like it's the self interfacing with the other and the others, right? These types of cultivation of these friendships that happen over many conversations and engagements and years, and then you have that kind of space and, like you said, Jock, in the trust. But the thing is like it really doesn't work unless everybody's doing kind of the work to be able to hold space for that. So yeah, I was just thinking about the kind of the juxtaposition between self-confirmation and self-cultivation, or you could say self-confrontation, right? That's a part of it, right? Where we said that like people will maybe challenge you on what you're thinking, or maybe not even directly, but like indirectly share something that they ascribe to, and it sits differently with what you maybe ascribe to, and then you do that circling you were talking about, Jockin, right? Where you just let the difference be. You don't try to, you allow it to be the case for insight so that you keep circling it. You don't shy away from it. You don't do the cutoff where you just say, well, that's it. We can't, we can't even talk anymore. Like you just let it be, and then you keep circling it and allow it to be the difference that it is, and allow everybody to learn something from that. It's so important. I mean, it's so important because it can happen. And I think it's a beautiful thing when it does. And I do think it's possible. And I think that's where sometimes, when we were talking about this showing an alternative, it's important to me because like there's both, there's an aspect of life that it is what it is, right? But there's also an aspect of life where it doesn't have to be that way. Like it could be different. I'm not saying that everything can be different necessarily, but there is a way to, if I'm thinking about my garden I'm growing right now, there's going to be a big difference if I do one thing over another for the health of the plants, for the harvest that can come from that. So it matters, and that's why thinking about virtue cultivation matters. Okay, then was there two last things? Okay, two last things. Well, just on the access deficiency, I thought that was a great point you were making, Javier, on less features. Like the algorithm in the background, like the grid and all of that, does make it so we can get on Zoom. But in Zoom, there are no features except the three of us talking, which is beautiful. This is the deficiency / simplicity I'm talking about, right? That we're talking about that does allow for the good access, right? The possibility for that. So, and then, yeah, last thing I was going to say, okay, I actually did touch on that. Is there anything else? No, I think that's all I have for now, guys, in my notes, but I thought that was all really, really good, really, really great. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, There's a couple of things. So I think Jockin, you kind of laid out like a topology of geopadic potential, which it starts with language, it goes to voice, it goes to face, and then it goes to person. Actually, what's ironic about that is that's exactly how people treat like the development of AI. It goes straight to language, to voice. Now they're trying to do face. Now they're trying to do embodied AI, person, etc. It's really interesting that is the kind of topology of what is happening. Of course, I want to add like images in there somewhere. I want to say images and language, and then voice, face, person. Because we also communicate like through those images. Now, I want to talk briefly about endoxa, this idea of common opinion. And I started getting this idea, Michelle, as you were talking, because you're bringing up the features of online. You know, we have like these blocking features, and this kind of rings well with like Jockin. Just it's funny how in the physical spaces maybe it wasn't that apparent, but like it becomes very much apparent in social media spaces that we actually have exit features. Block, mute, ban, shadow ban. We don't really have to deal with difference. That's the funny ethical kind of imposition through algorithmic spaces. It's actually we don't have to deal with this difference. We don't have to. It's not necessary. The other part of this endoxa is the way people talk online about difference. So, for example, I know you guys have seen this meme because I've seen these like types of memes and comments all the time, which is like people are like, if you're giving bad energy, I don't have time for that. Right? Or there's bad vibes, I don't got time for that. If you're on the wrong side, I can't deal with you. You're done. You're not on my side, you're on the wrong side. Right? So there's these interesting ethos of self-enclosure, of energy, vibes, all trying to indicate a kind of fundamental self-preservation sort of thing. I would say it's like basically an ethos of self-preservation because it's funny that people do use energy and vibes to kind of argue this point. And so difference is optional. So that's what really kind of strikes me is difference being optional. And then also when I was briefly, in college, kind of helping my professors, through reading groups and stuff, the social anxiety is like up the roof. I mean, I took these kids, they're not like kids, they're like young 20-year-olds, okay? I took them out to like, Panera or whatever, right? They were having anxiety of wanting to talk to the cashier to order. All because the little machine, self-order machine wasn't working. It wasn't working. So they were like, so some of them were like, no, I'm not going to order. I have anxiety. And I'm just like, Jesus Christ. I'm like, okay. But it shows that not only do we have issues with social anxiety, difference, it's like, I can't even get people to communicate their opinion in a setting. Like when I think about the net and I think about stumping ground for normal people, that would destroy them. that would like absolutely destroy them. Why? Because it's so disruptive. It's so disruptive to their whole state of being. Um, not only would we put them in a state of possible ignorance because they don't know what we're talking about, but then we put them in a state of difference with something that they have something to disagree about, but then they don't feel like they have the knowledge to really argue against the discourse that is being presented because they don't know enough, because they feel ignorant on the topic. So not only do they feel what they might label themselves as dumb or vulnerable, they wouldn't be able to engage. And so this creates a kind of self-return, self-retreat into themselves. And so it's interesting that when I think about how can one transition safely from an algorithmic space to a geopadic space without being destroyed, is really, I guess that is kind of the concern a little bit. And I think it is exactly like what Jockin and I have been pointing at. It's like trust and friendship. I guess if you don't have a friend there, then you're done. You're cooked. Like you're cooked. You're done. And like I think trust is also such an underrated concept in our times as well. Because I think the ability to really trust that everybody has good intentions in this kind of environment really goes a long way. So yeah, that's I think that's it.
Very good stuff. I mean, I'll jump in on Michelle. I had it in my notes. I want to reply to you. So if you made the difference about how algorithms and geopadic spaces have a very different relationship to the excess of time, I wrote my note. One, algorithms are there's different kinds of motion activity. Aristotle gives a distinction between what's called kinesis, like kinetic, think of it that way. It comes from that word, and ageia. So the difference is that kinesis is this kind of scattered, kind of disruptive. It's incomplete. It's an incomplete activity. And ageias are complete activities in itself. So I'm not that surprised that. So actually, in the Fasadic account, when we were doing theoria, we really were living the life of nous together at the stumping ground, because it was the activity of nous occurring right in front of us at the time. I'm not surprised that time basically washed away into an excess in a way that was self-nourishing. Like Javier and me were staying in the same hotel room. I think he can attest with me. We were getting like 3-4 hours of sleep. And Javier's younger than me. I'm almost 40, guys. Trust me. That kind of no sleep move was not going to work in any normal circumstances. But because of the Enegaea activity of the stumping ground, I was the first one up every day. Actually, it's ironic. I'm the oldest of the group. Me, Luber, and Javier were staying together. I was always the first one up and about. It's like, morning, boys, getting my coffee, having my muffin. I'll see you guys there. We got to go. Meanwhile, the youngest Luber was staying in bed to the very last minute. Love you, Luber. But my point is that that's not versus just like kinetic activity where it's just exhausting, it's depleting. So that's instantly my note to point out. One is we know the difference of the algorithmic to the geopadic is this quality of time. Basically, are you nourished or depleted? We go through a 3-hour net session. Sometimes I walk out of there, I'm always in a great mood. And sometimes I'm like, my mind's exploding as I have these insights and I have to go run and go write something, versus you spend that same amount of time in a university classroom. I mean, you tell me how you feel about that. Are you walking out of there more nourished? I've had experience of this because I think people who don't know, I am a professor in graphic design and typography. That's my specialty topic of teaching. I will tell you that I teach the classes in it and go through the courses in my coursework in the university setting, teaching design and whatnot, versus the nonprofit organization I run called TypeThursday around the world. And people, and actually, fun enough, people have come from art school, go to have that experience with critique, and then go to TypeThursday and see that experience of the type crit and go, there's a qualitative difference.
Mm-hmm.
There's a completely different experience. They're energized, they're motivated, they want more of it. Why is that? Because we didn't have the word until this discussion. It was geopitic versus the same. This is interesting. Remember, it's the same content. It's actually the same content, but because it's in a different container space of discourse, completely different experience in terms of the quality of time and how we feel in it after the process of it. I find that really an important distinction. I think another big note related to that, I wanted to, is actually related to that second part, is Javier's point about the anxiety to speak in discourse is actually a really important issue. It's actually a cultivation of knowledge. And I have to be sympathetic. Listen, when I was in my young 20s, I was the dum-dum. I didn't have much to work with. I was like, that's bad. I don't know why it's bad. Like, I think this is important because a lot of people do have that position, especially when they're young. They just don't have the equipment to even articulate what they're thinking. And I think that's actually important, is that actually that's an area of cultivation that needs to require. Like, to enter spaces of discourse does require a certain equipment of insight, understanding. And these are the things, by the way, these are the things that are related to literature, reading, thinking, and writing. That's why it's so important, because I remember when I was an undergrad, I hated the writing assignments. I hated the reading assignments because no one really gave me the context. I just want to make things. You know, not the discourse about it. I wasn't that interested about it. In fact, actually, it was kind of a stigma that basically, if you're going to talk about work instead of making the work, probably means you're not that good. Now, are you? Because you would just be making the work. You wouldn't be talking about it. Now, would you? But as I got older, I've realized, well, actually, that was really important. Those reading assignments, the writing, because the cultivation of the mind is not a given. One of the best ways I found this out when I started doing interview series for TypeThursday. And I started my initial listening of my transcripts of my interviews. I realized how dumb I was. Like, how much I was actually not talking and not saying. I was saying there was a lot of utterances, but not actually any no knowledge. It's very insightful. So I think that's an important element, that the algorithms are not going to provide that to you. In fact, it gives you the opposite. It actually relates to what Javier said about the kind of topology of image, text, voice, face, person. A lot of times people actually just discourse with each other through mediated symbols that don't do the thinking for them. Memes. Basically, people's entire friendships are just meme sharing. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if that's the totality of your experience, the point is what you did. You offloaded your thinking. And actually, that's the point, is that, you know, I think I've said this, I've heard many times philosophers say this, like, everybody's doing it. It's just a matter of you doing well or not. And the thing is, you need basic equipment to be able to enter discourse spaces and be effective in it. And I think that's an important area of subtlety we need to be very fair about. But that's important because that means then there's an idea of cultivation over time. So any development is over a period of time. And Encantos, to use Aristotle's comment about it, meaning that you're not fully who you are all at once. You're over a period, you're a form over time. And one of those things is your cultivation of your intellectual activity is part of your development. And it can't be just like obfuscated and delegated to algorithms. This is partly why this part is true. The fear of AI, of ChatGPT doing all your thinking for you, it's so terrifying, because then you're realizing there's nothing for you thinking anymore. There's just impulses. There's no articulation. That's what's so terrifying. And when it's in a spiral of self-confirmation, which is different, actually the big note from Aristotle about this was really important about the friendship of virtue, is it's another self. Isn't that interesting? That in the activity of friendship, of virtue, there's another self. It's not an A, which is, why is another self? It means it's a person with, it gives you, as a person of virtue, but another reflect, you have this return back, not a self-confirmation, it's self-witnessing. So they use a lot of subtle language difference of witnessing versus confirmation. There's a very big difference of the two. there's a much I can say a lot more about that, but I'm going to sideline that for a minute because I just want to add one note for Javier's note about exit features. He's totally correct about that's basically one of the key notes of algorithms. They do have an operation of exit. That's very much how they operate on. I think, Michelle, your comment isolation as a kind of exit, totally fair. We do have that in physical spaces. It's called jail and poverty. Those are exit mechanisms. So I just want to know we do have that in the sense of, in poverty, especially if you're not digital, if you don't interface in the right way, you're going to just be sub-exited. You're going to exit out by being in poverty and then mediated through those channels. And that will most likely interface with jail. Again, another mechanism. I just want to remind everybody that United States has the highest rate of jail rate of people incarcerated in the world. Kind of odd. Basically, it's like, without the point, we moved to a more algorithmic space because we concluded how to mediate difference is not worth it, and cultivating civic behavior is not worth it. We can't do it. So we're just going to let the algorithm handle it. How does algorithms handle it? Self-exit in terms of incarceration. By the way, I mean, that's the thing. It's like, listen, this encroachment of the algorithmic to the real life, I am like the champion of this. I think it's just really critical because I made a story. I call it terms of service brutalism. That is, so we have architectural brutalism that's like deafening and crushing us in terms of our lived spaces. If you go in New York State, if you go to the state universities, a lot of them are built in the 1960s, 70s. They were all made with brutalist architecture. Now, thank God, there's a lot of nature. There's like a lot of plant life to kind of buffer the damage, but in winter especially, they are hellscapes of absolute agony because just dead concrete, gray, deteriorating concrete in snow. That's all you get in all these campuses. It's absolutely deafening as a deafening space. Terms of service brutalism is my play on that, where by the algorithmic protocols of how we use apps and interface with physical spaces are defined by terms of service. The example I used, I shared on the net was I prepaid for parking in Atlanta. I was staying overnight. I found a parking spot where I wanted to stay. It was cheaper than parking at the hotel in Atlanta. So I did that. I prepaid for it. I parked. Everything was appropriate. I was in the right spot. I triple checked. There's no tenant. There's no one there. There's no tenant, like no person working the parking lot. So you just park your car. I go to the hotel. I go to the conference I'm supposed to go to. I do my thing. I come back next day. My car's double booted. Not one boot, double booted. They stamp on the stickers that you're fine. You're impounded. You gotta now scan with use your phone to scan this QR code, and now you gotta pay the fee to get this boot off. And I tried calling them. Nope, the manager will get back to you in a week. There's no humans to mediate the difference. This is an issue of the algorithmic justice. Universal justice has been misapplied, and I can't even object. Like, I cannot persuade in the moment. My only option, you got to pay it now and then make an appeal afterwards. So obviously there's multiple problems. This is what I meant by like, look at this operation of exit. First of all, what are you going to do if you don't have a cell phone and mobile payment? What if you don't have that option? For example, we got that issue. What if you don't have the money at all? Like, et cetera, all these things. Anyways, the point is, that was actually really terrifying because, like, notice here, this really was an algorithmic operation now applied to life. And there was no exit. Daniel and Michelle had actually, when I shared the story, and I remember this, you guys were in a complete like meltdown because you use a third-party hotel service to plan a trip, and it was a disaster. And no one and everyone responsible was nothing we could do. It's the algorithm. It's the terms of service. What can we do? It was a complete obfuscation of agency. That the policy was how ethics was going to get applied to this, and how we're going to mediate with each other, and any difference of distinction of missing of error was completely just out of hand, like completely out of everyone's hand. No difference in error could not be addressed in those spaces. So I just want to share those notes. I'm going to give it to everybody else to talk.
Can I just ask a quick question, Jockin? What you were saying about our societal exit mechanisms end up being poverty and jail. Were you, I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. maybe this is a stretch. How do you think those things are impacted by the technological algorithmic exits we have, or are we like to bridge a connection? Is that a
I
little
can't
much?
comment on that yet. I have
Okay,
not, I
okay.
literally came up with it on the spot.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah,
me
yeah.
just being inspired on the
Okay.
spot.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
can't make a comment about,
Well,
I have to be honest. I want to add another one that actually just came to mind that's even worse. Self-exit,
oh
suicide.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, I'm just going to be honest in terms of
Yeah,
like
yeah,
how this operation plays out is one of those three. If I had to play
yeah.
this out. Now, what
Hmm.
you're asking is the question of what is the relationship of the digital
Mhm.
algorithmic to the physical algorithmic.
Mhm.
I've not thought that through. This is just a
Mhm.
lot. This is a geopedic moment,
Yeah,
everybody,
exactly.
because we've had discourse. We even did an internal written document summarizing the discourse. And here we go. Javier is going to. I saw in the chat. He's going to go in with the self-exit mode. And now I just came up with a new insight through us talking through the commentary about this. So I don't have an insight yet about the relationship, but I think it's absolutely there. And I would say, again, we're not going to address these problems of incarceration, poverty, and self-exiting, suicide. And I know this is going to flag the video. I said it 3 times now, but I don't care. I'd rather say the name so we know what we're talking about. Because we're treating all these as algorithmic problems. Because that's what, because Javier had a conversation we had about that. We had a conversation about this at the hotel stay. I remember this related to the military. So I'm going to let Javier take it from here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I also had a great talk with Pei about it. You know, the army can't solve suicide. It's like bewildered by it. But the moment you treat everything as a protocol for suicidal ideation, the rule of thumb is just to report the guy that's telling you. So responsibility gets offloaded, just like what Jockin's talking about. And something similar to like a jail is to be institutionalized for 3 days or more. And so it's like, why would you tell anyone if we know predictably what's going to happen to me or somebody else? And the crazy thing about it is nobody actually wants it. Nobody actually wants that. Nobody actually wants to be institutionalized. So why is that the most? Why is that the no? You know, why is that not the most biggest red flag of our own ethical thing? Well, I mean, some of the discourse is culturally set, which is, you know, this idea of man is harm to himself, could be harm to others, etc. That kind of philosophy. That would be something that we would have to deal with. But Jockin made me think of this quote in the Nicomachean Ethics that I'm pretty sure Aristotle would be like, I would have never predicted this. There's this quote that says, unjust action is when you assign oneself too much of things intrinsically good. And that's how you can tell a man becomes a tyrant. What's interesting about this is who would have ever expected the algorithm to become a tyrant of who holds too much of what is intrinsically good? You we can't even I think this is why virtue ethics is so important, is because there is no manifest signs that we can blame and point to as a human being. There isn't blameworthy qualities. Like Jockin talking about terms of service brutalism is just like the fact that you can offload it because it's not a human being. It's just the algorithm. That's just how it is. I'm sorry. Actually, a lot of work functions like that, and that really pisses me off. But it's crazy because it's like that's where we're heading, where the ethical situation is no longer it's no longer relevant, really. It's really no longer relevant. You don't, it's not, it's like optional. That's what's crazy. It's like actually a digital option. Do you want to be ethical? Yes or no? It's like legitimately an option. You don't have to be ethical. From every other paradigm, I felt like it was you had to be ethical, and then we had to debate the ethical means. This paradigm shift, I really do feel like the ethical is just optional. Um, and so it's funny that this quote from Aristotle about the unjust action is when we assign oneself too much of things intrinsically good really shows how who would have ever expected something abstract like an algorithm to hold all that is intrinsically good, and there's just nothing there's nothing to blame. We could just say it's the algorithm, but there's nothing virtuously to blame on that kind of level. Like we can't pin down a person. We could maybe pin down the creators or something. Um, but it's just odd. It's odd that whoever would have expected the good itself to become its like I don't even know how to explain it, like its own like thing, like its own little virtual entity that we cannot the good is abstracted from the human being. That's what it is. The good is abstracted from the human being.
Javier, it's almost like we need the beautiful to kind of safeguard the good in the first place.
Yep. No, 100%. 100%. Do you want to comment more on that, Jockin? That's all I have to say.
That's outside the scope of this video. So, but we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
I have a conversation coming up about this point later.
Okay.
If I can jump in, that was all really great from both of you guys. Thank you. Just my very quick in the moment theory on the relationship between the two of societal exits and algorithmic exits. Though again, this is it's just me talking about two concept ideas, but I'm going to move on quickly from it because I think it would demand like a lot more time and thought on it. But I do think that perhaps the relationship, like I do think there is probably something to the algorithmic exits that has made self-exit higher. Like I do think that like we see especially in like if you look at statistically, even like during like 2020 and COVID, a lot of stuff was online and people aren't able to like go see their grandma or school. Like there seems to be a correlation between, I don't want to say a direct correlation. See, I just don't have the statistics, but anecdotally, it's like that. It seems as though the algorithmic exits do possibly make the statistics of self-exit higher because it's difficult. And maybe we just, well, now we have like internet and we can gather statistics like we didn't have enough to compare it with in the past. So maybe this is a void point, but it's a theory. I think that there are things about like, there are also very unfortunate forums that can even encourage people to take that choice as like, and so I think there's some problematic dimensions to the algorithmic space that do not equip people to know what to do, who to go to, what, like how to think. And often, like, I do think that the way that somebody in that position may be best helped is actually not through some algorithmic answer, like the little booklet you get out or the hotline responses. Not that there's no place for those, okay? There's a place for that, but it's often like reigniting in that person an interest for life itself again. Like it's that reignition of interest and excitement and wonder, and like, oh my gosh, I remember I used to have something I was like really interested in. Like I think all of that revival is really important and is a better address to a person in that particular hardship and difficulty than the direct addresses of like, you need to be contained, you need, so I'm just. And then the other thought was that, what was my other thought? I don't know. Oh, okay. This is the thought that is a little devil's advocate-y to the conversation, because I do wonder if having the algorithmic exits in general and just landscape, if we can call it that, does actually provide people a way to not be as prone to like crime and such because they're just doing it on the web. They're just doing it behind like the shields of our screens and things like this. Again, I don't have any statistics on this at all. I think crime is unfortunately just a part of being fallen humans. I'm not saying that like, but I think there is, I mean, this is what you get from a lot of like transhumanist people, right? Like their good intention is that we could maybe not have to deal with all of these tragic things that are part of being human if we become something other than just being human, right? Like if we can just go into the virtual exclusively, we won't have to worry about physical harm and all of this stuff. So I think that like there's a lot of good intent that even the virtual spaces have projections for, right? At the end of the day, we are still human. I do think we still have thymos and eros and things that we deal with, right? That are going to make us still have to grapple with those things if we want to still like procreate as a species or have real friendships as a species, you know, anything that requires some physical if we eat, we all eat, right? Like some contact with the land. So I don't know. I'm just throwing out the kind of a thought here. I mean, again, we're actually talking about cultivating the geopadic and dialectic with the algorithmic technological spaces. So we're not just doing a kind of exit strategy and being like straight Luddites or like, you know, Amish to the landscape of the internet. But I do think that sometimes that those are people's arguments for why, like, hey guys, it's okay that we have the algorithmic technologically, because we can avoid violence, right? We can avoid this, we can avoid that. And it's like, it sounds so right, kind of like it sounds so possibly good, and yet, you know, it does cause a whole Thomas, you're like, I'm raising the hand. Okay, go ahead. So I'm gonna leave it there.
I had to use the symbolic symbol of a raising hand to emphasize my degree of wanting to speak about this. Sorry,
Please,
Javier,
yeah.
I'm jumping in. Because actually that's my example of it. The problem is that violence is symbolic. So the problem is just because you actually, I would actually say this, the unfortunate problem with the algorithmic spaces is that it created more otherness of symbolic objects that to channel one's aggression.
So it's like we might be even in a more violent time, or at least comparably violent time, just because it doesn't necessarily take place with like, you know, frontline combats with people, and you know,
I like to think of it more as like a lever that's been reared back more in waiting. So even though in the appearance, is that we're less violent now because we've been putting these
little safe screens, sterilized environments,
safe spaces, or just in general, this algorithmic siloing that remove difference. Like basically, if you don't agree with someone, exit, separate. And society's operation is if you're not going to cooperate with the project of society, exit. You know, and then we'll take it from there. The problem is what that does now is it sets the spring back of this is where Nassim Taleb point of anti-fragility and fragility is really important, because what that does is the fragile gives the appearance of smoothness. It removes difference, volatility, stress. It removes it artificially on the appearance that everything's under control and stable. But then underneath, hidden, is basically a recipe guarantee of 10 times the explosive response. So the example Nassim always uses is basically economic, right? That the federal government's intervention on the economy creates stability artificially, that every 10 years or 20 years requires a critical failure in the financial instruments that has to get mediated by more and more extreme interventions to get us back to stability. So this is part of the relation of politics of violence, is that for example, when we had COVID occurred, we got more isolated, more social. Black Lives Matter occurred. Black Lives Matter and the reaction to that, I believe, was Charlottesville, where those violent acts of protest occurred, which had a lot of symbolic explosions. I know you and Gail have a very personal relationship to that episode from conversations. So, and that's caused more polarization, more requirement of algorithmic spaces where we can't hold difference. And the terror everybody has is that, quite honestly, now with nuclear weapons, all it's going to take is a two groups that have this degree of difference how are they going to address the difference if they're algorithmic?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just the, but you're right. So
Yeah.
thus any argument that, oh, the initial appearance of stability, lack of violence is it's iatrogenic, meaning clear, known, short-term advantage that's minimal.
Yeah.
So long-term, unexpected, explosive harm that comes later.
Yeah.
So I just use that, and now I use that model to talk about this, why this is so critical. And I think I should relate another note to, you're right, that the human beings needs relationships to exist. Aristotle says this: a human that cannot exist in a polis is either an animal or a god. We humans are not self-sufficient unless we're in a polis. This is actually very important because this blows up any argument of individual that from Aristotle's account, our unit of evaluation should be the individual. Aristotle says no, that's not reasonable, because we need the human in a relationship to be fully human. Yeah. So the kind of scope of relationship is much larger. So when if a person's systematically isolated, ostracization was death, and that was the stance in the past. It really was social death had a very high correlation to physical death, and we're just seeing. So thus, Michelle, your argument that digital ostracization of exiting it would correspond to self-exit, and I don't think that's unreasonable. Yeah, that's just on a riff point, just building on that.
I just want to say something really quick, and Javier, please feel free to jump in. Just a very, very quick point to talk about complexifying exiting really quick. I mean, I'm not talking about self-exiting. I'm saying that we do as humans seem to need to figure out some ways of having that feature. Okay, for example, let me just think on the abstract level. We sort of exit consciousness every night when we sleep, right? We have, so what I'm saying is that, like, if I'm really upset, I know it's healthier for me to step away and go walk around the house. And then I can speak without being so clouded by my huge emotions, right? So I guess I'm just saying that society often has to grapple with that. And I do think that it's something that it's a hard thing. It's a hard thing to know how to do that well and to do that right. I mean, the context that I think is best at interplay with exit and entrance or whatever, inclusion or something, is like, it makes me think of like disciplining, right? With in familial settings, you know, where you have to do a healthy, like, okay, you're hitting the other child with a bat, so we're going to need to have you put the bat away, right? And you know, let's move you guys to like maybe different spaces or whatever. Like, so I'm just saying that it does seem like it's a human thing to have to use it to some degree, but how we use it and the way we think about the exits. And I don't think they should be like, the hope is that you can reintegrate, right? The child has that break from that so that they can come back and play, like, and, you know, realize, oh, wait, you know what, let's put the bat away and let's go, you know, let's do bubbles instead or something. Like, it's maybe the thought is like, we could do some different configuring of exiting where like the bat exits, but the children stay so they can realize, oh wait, that was harming the other person. We could do something different though. And the underlying was like, you know, you kind of get to the underlying of like, I see you're hitting for this reason, but this would be a better, like, this is a different option. Again, we're talking about these alternatives, showing alternatives, right? You show alternatives to a child so they can say, oh, I could actually address what my frustration is in a different way. Yeah. So I'm just thinking about, so yeah, I think that's important too. Yeah.
No, of course. I mean, by the way, again, this is important because there's been some people who've shared this idea with these distinctions, and then the response is all algorithms are bad, all geopedic is good. No, we're not saying that. We're simply stating that the problem is when it only are algorithms, and there's no larger container. So the family is a container.
Family is a container. Example. I think it should be a geopedic container for the interplay between the algorithmic and the geopedic. So yeah.
That'd be one example, by the way. Another note is forgiveness. A moral space of forgiveness is actually a geopedic space, to be honest with you, just to add that note. Meaning absolutely. Like when true valid violations have occurred, is exit appropriate to respond to the violation for personal safety reasons or even a sense of justice? The answer is yes. It's important. But the thing is, if there's no geopedic space of forgiveness, then all you is a perpetrator for the rest of your life. That's
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
There's no other answer. You're calcified, frozen into this state of exit. There's no way to integrate back in.
Yeah, no, that's all really good. Javier, do you want to say something?
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, it's funny because like we were talking about like anger. I have like two books, Buddhist books on anger, and they gave like this really funny example. And I think a lot of the exit strategies in the virtual space could possibly lead to this kind of outcome of like I think it's like the Dalai Lama uses this example of just like, so you want to practice anger and you're a monk on a, it's like a story of just like a monk on a hill practicing anger, and then a guy comes in and starts pissing him off, and he's like, oh, I thought you were supposed to be practicing anger, right? Like basically it's this fact of like, and this is kind of what Jockin was getting at by it's like this spring that's getting like pulled back, but then it's going to just explode. Is that actually a lot of these exiting strategies can fool you into thinking that that you have cultivated a certain disposition and that you can perhaps tolerate difference, but that's because you haven't really been interacting with the kind of difference. You have actually just been holding a kind of digital isolationism kind of stuff. So that can really fool you into like in your own assessment of your abilities to handle difference. And I think that's very much possible that could happen with people, just like this idea of like, oh yeah, I can handle difference, but well, if you're basically a digital monk, that probably is not going to work out for you. Now the thing that when you're talking about exiting, Michelle, this returning, it made me think of, I feel like exiting, people can either cold exit, like I don't want to, I'm not returning. And then there's the exit, like Daniel always talks about, you always have to return.
Yeah, the human journey.
Right.
Yeah.
You always have to return. And I feel like that's the only exit that should be the answer, really, you know, that we should return. But how we return and what we do with that space of returning is this idea of like kind of what Jockin basically hinted at, which is habitus, developing habits. We don't look at our exiting as an opportunity to develop habits. And I think this is what you were getting at, Michelle, just like what you're doing is when you're taking the child out of the situation and placing him somewhere else, is you're trying to help them discern a certain behavior, but you're also helping them set a kind of motion for habit of when this happens, you do this. When this happens, you do this. You start thinking this way. So I realized that, our common conception of cultivation is just productivity. So a lot of people think, and this is why I think you're right about like this idea of like it's connected. It can be connected to self-exit because productivity has no clear end. We're all developing habits, self-help, everything has no clear end other than it's just a pure productivity for the sake of itself. And of course, I feel like the end result is just that you want to end yourself. I mean, to me, I feel like that's pretty obvious. I feel like that's pretty obvious, but I would be banned for saying that. I'm probably going to be banned for it now. But I'll let Jockin go.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in because I was on a multi-day rampage about this in the chat, in our Instagram chat, where I shared a video of, it looked like an elementary school teacher recording his interaction with the students. And we're giving them updates about the class, how they're doing and everything, what their plan is for the day. And he goes to this section, goes, all right, everybody, So it's like algorithms are just interpenetrated into the reality of this. In the area, I was so livid. Like at some points, like I want to point out like where I'm okay with it. Like he's saying, all right, look at our scores. Here's how we're doing to the rest of the population. You know, we're a little bit below, but we got better. You know, we were 3% below the average. Now we're 2%. One could be a little, okay, whatever. It's fine. I was fine. I was like, okay, cool. But then he gets to say, but God, remember, what are we aiming for? Ice cream party at the end of the semester, end of the school year. And then they go, how many points do we need for it? And then the class says out loud what's presented on the screen, which is like a photo of the ice cream. Like, here's the image, kids. This is what you want. And then it's like, they go, 180 points is what we need. And then a couple of the kids go, huh? Because they were like, wait a minute. It wasn't 180 points before. And then the teacher goes, that's right. Because that's what we do. We always got to level up. I was so mad because the kids were so upset. And I don't blame them. Because it was like, dude, I want the ice cream party. I remember being that young. That was awesome. Having ice cream at school, that'd be great. And then I get dog. That was a dog water move that you make a promise to them that they need to achieve this points to get this outcome. That's justice. And then this is tyranny. Because in the middle of it, you change your mind and go, no, now it's not 150 points to get your ice cream party class. Now it's 180. And if you get 180 before the end of the semester, I'm going to make it 200. And he's asking the students to go, why we got to do this? Why we got to raise our levels? Why we got to do it? And the students are giving like the worst like self-help ideology you would get from like Andrew Tate. Like, you just got to do stuff. You always just got to do more, bro. You always just got to do more, bro. I remember a conversation with Javier, we're talking about this energy. It's like, you just got to keep doing things until you stop feeling. It's just on another side note. But the point is, I'm just sitting here going, this is a disaster. This is when I put the line down. It's where algorithms are great because they give you something intelligible, concrete, and we can orient with that. There's nothing wrong with this. But when you make promises and commitments around that, and then you just, for no reason other than to say, we just got to raise our numbers up because it's good to raise our numbers up. To what end? It wasn't agreed to beforehand. It wasn't acknowledged. It wasn't even addressed. If he really meant to say, because I believe in your talent to do better in your mathematics and your English and all that. And that's why I know you could do better. And that's why we're going to do this. That's still not right in that context. He made a promise to those students. They agreed to that promise. He needs to honor that promise. Now, if he wants to say, if we do more, we get another ice cream party or we get a pizza party with the ice cream. I'm okay with that too. I just think it's just dog water, this state of like, this is why virtue ethics can get sabotaged and hijacked, because then it becomes just optimization and productivity for its own sake. We just make the number go up. Make number go up equals better. Which, by the way, Michelle, this is partly why when we talked about the NFTs and art spaces failing in Web3, failing to be what they promised to be beautiful economics, was because they were captured in algorithmic thinking. That's why. We didn't have the language at the time to say, here's what the gap was. They were thinking algorithmically. They couldn't even think geopadia in terms of what they're trying to do with this. Because all it was number goes up. We make stuff and then number goes up. That means good. It's the same operation. That's what I got. So I just want to share that with the group.
Yeah, no, that was good. I understand your indignation. I feel it. Well, I mean, and it's just to me, it makes me think of our points before on excess, where it's just a runaway excess, right? Just more, it's like the concept of like in that situation, the better principle to teach the children was honoring a promise, honoring your word, right? Versus like, if we get a goal, we should push ourselves further. Why exactly? If
like
you can push yourself further, but
children,
you can't keep a promise, you know what I mean? Like that's no good. Yeah.
Like the pain of the, like, it was really like some of the students were really like, they gave reasons, but you could sense they didn't believe it. They were, but then the teacher was so uncritically going, that's right. We just got to up our game, man. You just got to push harder because it's great. It's good to push harder. I'm sorry. Cause actually, I mean, a chat comment to us is like, oh yeah, this is great for your bosses love this. Corporations love this because they can just plug in. Here's what you're optimizing for. Here's what your goal is. Go hit it. Oh, good job. Now go hit it. Now go make a bigger number. It's it's this complete capture of virtue. Because there's no telos for the human activity.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of all this? If you don't have an answer to that, you're a dog. You can't do anything. And actually, I was going to say before, that question of exit, that cold exit, like the self-sustaining exit versus the return exit, you can't, that is just, as Javier said, that's optional. You have no grounds of discourse to even persuade, to deliberate, to use Daniel's language and Michelle, your language, to deliberate this point. Should one return? It comes off as completely oppressive just your opinion, bro, that you need a return. Unless you can give some account of the telos of human activity. And the statement here is, priorly, I would have said, if you want a life of beauty, you must return. If you choose not to, you can have a good life. You will not have a beautiful life. Like, that's the choice. Now, I would say another way to put it is, if you want a geopitic life or a quality of geopitic in your life, you must, like, if you want that in this container versus an algorithmic space, you must return. So in the examples in marriage or in family, there's a lot of discourse about that. Remember, no contact, cut your parents off, no contact. The only way that does not look like just completely a personal subjective option to how do you, and especially is the question, here's the problem. What if the other side is completely unwilling to change? You don't really have an argument. You can't give the claiming, but they're family. And the response is, well, no, this is my choice. And you can't really tell me I need to. We don't have any equipment. At least this discussion can give some grounding to say, yes, you can choose to. You can choose. If you believe their relationship with you is algorithmic and that's the relationship you want with them too, and that's all it's going to be, then the exit of the relationship is the rational choice. And there's a way around it. But if you believe and your parents believe that you want family to be a geopitic space, then that's the only way you can even ground this justification. So sit in the difference and the tension and the conflict and work through it for the sake of some larger purpose. That's not indefinite. Anyways, that's just a riff point for me.
Yeah. That's all been very good. I was meditating as you guys were talking a little bit more on, yeah, I think that's a great point, the return. It makes me think of, Daniel's extensive work on David Hume and the Humean journey, right? That brings you back out of common life, then back into common life. Actually, it's funny. I've been Jockin, I'll tell you now, like my notes on something I want to write is like, can you do a Humean journey through the internet? Is that an acceptable way to exit common life and return to common life? I don't know. It's out for debate at the moment. But I do think it's an interesting question. And the reason why I got there as contemplating that is because if you look at a lot of like particularly there's some I guess influencers, I don't know if they would call themselves that, but there's kind of this thought of like, you've learned so much, you've kind of undone a lot of your thinking, but now you don't know how to just think your own thoughts and like have your own sort of intuition. And so it's like almost courses to reclaim that. And it's almost like that's interesting to me, because it's like you're doing a kind of return through a medium that took you away from maybe what you priorly thought, or it gave you this sort of wider scope of things. And then you're like, okay, but then come back to yourself. So, but it's also still in the medium of that which took you out of yourself and can at any moment, like just at any time you go back onto whatever it is, Instagram or TikTok or whatever social media avenue it is. So I'm kind of grappling with if that's like, if there's, I mean, part of me thinks it's great in some ways that people are kind of saying, hey, like get back to your own, what do you think, versus like, let me look it up. I mean, there's a place for looking stuff up, but I also think it's really interesting. I really love wordplay. So it's always interesting to me to think about, oh, let me look it up. Especially the language of lookup. We look up stuff on Google, but it makes me think of like there's a Psalm 121, where it talks about like, you know, my eyes look to the hills. From where does my help come from? And it talks about like looking up to God, right, as the ultimate helper and healer and provider. So it's interesting to me about this idea of kind of look up, like we're looking things up, but it kind of has the language of look up to what? The algorithm, right? The thing that can answer your questions and solve your problems for you, right? We tend to have these structures anyways, as humans, traditionally and historically, and also in our modern times. It's just that it switches to a different other, or big other, if you want to say that. But yeah, I guess anyway, so I'm saying all of this because in one way it can be a good thing. Like it's almost like a voice in the wilderness, sort of reminding you to like go back to, you know, touch grass or whatever, to reduce it to that. And that's where I think about, like, I did use this language. I never explained myself in our chat when I was talking about being spies, right? I think I did mention it a little bit at Stumping Grounds, but I do think there is a role for being in algorithmic spaces and saying, and sort of being like, hey, there's this alternative. Now, can people do that without getting destroyed? You were saying, you know, Javier, you were contemplating that question. I don't know. I do think you fundamentally have to have people open to it themselves. I don't think you can force it on people. I don't think you should anyway, because it can destroy them. And that, in a sense, should be their own choice if they want to go through the kind of self-destruction and then sublation, for lack of a better terminology. But yeah, so yeah, it's grappling with like, is there a place for this activity in the algorithmic spaces? Or is it just like, that's really cute, you know, you're saying to get back to yourself with an online course, you know, it's just, it's funny. But at the same time, like it can matter to have people think through certain things that people maybe wouldn't have otherwise thought of, to be able to reclaim a kind of sense of not fixedness, but a type of stability in the fray of information, in the fray of otherness. Well, here's the thing. This is the funny thing. I don't think that fray of otherness is actual otherness, right? Because like we talked about, the actual otherness is often going to be in the Geopadia, where you have to really sit, really dwell with the difference, really be with the difference, and not just run away from it. The thing with the weird thing about social media to me is that it literally inundates the senses with so much otherness or difference, I could say that. And you know, you talked about like, we don't have to deal with difference, it's optional. Absolutely. But you see it. And your brain can't help but think this, and it's so overwhelming. And I don't think we are really designed to do that. I don't think we are really designed to be able to handle that in some ways. And that's where back to my contemplation of like, can the internet be like a human journey, right? But I'm going all over the place. I'm going to distill it back to this idea of yeah, this return. I think that's absolutely right what you're saying with that, and I think you're absolutely spot on, Jockin, with how that relates to beauty. But I may have left a little some loose threads there, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it to you, Jockin. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to pass it to Javier because he hasn't spoken in a second.
Yeah. Sorry,
But,
Javier, just
because actually it relates to what, because Javier's original point, remember, actually the thread back. So I like that idea. Use the course as a point of like someone's pitching their course for you to think. It's kind of, so I just think that's really funny because the conclusions of the discussion in a group about this, about like the original question that Javier asked, like, so what is liberality? Where should we spend our money in the digital spaces? It is not to be told to go buy courses, to be told what to think, right? And it's kind of passive consumerary mode.
Right.
Instead, it needs to be engagement with geopedic texts. Or another way we would put this, we talked about this in the past, is that art has polysemitic properties where it is not the summary bullet points. Give me the 5 key ideas of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where it's synthesized into a nice and clean algorithm of bullet points and cliff note understanding. No, it's sitting with real art, either philosophical texts, literature, you know, either contemporary literature or things like Shakespeare or any kind of any Jane Austen, or like any kind of literary, any experience of a geopedic object that we would call polysemitic in the past in our discourses together, are grounds for difference, are allowing, are spaces for this insight to come in, right? And the thing is, on a digital space, one of the great things about it is having spaces where people are reading books together. So for example, me, Luber, and Javier are reading Al-Ghazali's Revival of the Religious Sciences, book 4, section 4 of it. That's an example of it. So I think that's an example where again, I think it's very clear, even though we're talking through this huge contrast difference of the algorithmic and geopedic, this is simply to draw out that they have a relationship. And that unfortunately, without this name of the geopedic, all we saw was the algorithmic. And it was only accidental or these sparkles or glimpses. Here, I'll say it, the beautiful. These glimpses were there that were always there. It's just we didn't have a name. So the purpose of having a name is now we can point to it, even if it still glimmers and flickers of it. But the fact that we have a name now, we can actually now address it better. But actually back to Javier. So I'm going to pass over to Javier because the whole point was reading groups where if you are going to pay money, it should be with people who are reading text together as a reading group, hold each other accountable to meet, read the text and discuss it and share our insights. That's actually, ironically, the way you cultivate philosophical practice. Yeah. It's actually, that's in terms of the contemporary period, I would say. And digital spaces allow you to do that because it's very hard to find people in your local community who are going to read Aristotle or Al-Ghazali or Hume or Jane Austen or whatever. The digital space allows you to gather people in disparate geographical locations into geopedic spaces if it's done this way. But as you can tell, if you didn't have this language, we couldn't even talk through this. It would be, you just got to take a course from someone who knows is going to synthesize to a bunch of easy course lectures with high production value to tell you what to think. Ironically, the way to help you make you think. Okay, that's what I got.
No, I mean, there's things that have come to my mind. So Michelle, with your homecoming question, like, how does one return to the digital? Can one return to the digital? Yeah, I think we're seeing it. Between all us three, the people that were the stumpy ground. One of the features that really stand out is once you really experience a geopedic space, the way you return to the algorithmic space changes.
Yeah.
It reconfigures the way you want to use that space because now you understand exactly what the goal is. The goal is to also go back to the geopedic space. So it actually helps you reconfigure, reframe how you want to use the algorithmic space. Because before, without naming this space, we had no idea. We had no idea what we were doing this for. But now it gives an end to the algorithmic space. What is that end? The geopedic space. And so then we can go back to the algorithm space and it enriches that space because we're cultivating ourselves to go back to that space. Right? Like the fact that we had the stumpy ground. Okay. We went back to our lives, back to an algorithmic space, and then we're like, hey, I got this idea. Heard you want to talk about it too. And actually, we spent more time in that algorithmic space talking about that idea than doing the other options that are available within that space. Right? We spend more of our time is spent towards that than if we didn't have that space, we would have just gone back to our lives and I would have been watching reels, laughing at a teacher, lifting up the price of ice cream points, and I never would have thought a single day about it. I would have never thought a single thing about it. I would have been like, dang, that sucks. Next reel. Okay, next reel. So I think there is a way to return. I think there is a way to return, and I think having a name for this space obviously really matters because it's exactly this is why it would be a huge misunderstanding if people think that we're saying algorithm is bad. Algorithm is only bad because we don't have another name for the thing that reorients our relationship to the algorithm itself. we don't have a thing from the outside to help us frame exactly what it is we need to have with this algorithm. I think, trying to think if I had anything else I wanted to say. Yeah, I was just really thinking a lot about what you brought up with that, Michelle. And yeah, this thing of what Jockin's saying of like, you know, we have to make this return. It shouldn't be optional. It should not be optional. And that actually there is one thing I wanted to say. Virtue ethics is frightening, I would say. Precisely because, I mean, I'm just trying to think from the framing that we are today about why virtue ethics would be frightening. Virtue ethics is frightening because you have to fit yourself in this mean that is not algorithmic, that is not clear, exactly how you should necessarily frame yourself, frame your behavior. Yes, Aristotle says something like right attitude and right time and right person. What does that mean? Like I can literally hear the existential like moaning of our generation, like being like, what do you mean like right time and like right attitude and like how would I do that? How would I begin? Well, at the very least, it begins with attempting, like actually attempting to make without an algorithmic offloading of ethical responsibility. And this is why forgiveness and courage are, I think, in my opinion, some of the most pivotal responses. The courage to make the ethical move not optional, then to have the forgiveness of you're gonna mess up, as well as society should have this forgiveness so that way we can then get on this path of not always offloading the ethical option. And then, of course, trust is the very thing that holds all those things together. It's like the dark night of the soul kind of metaphor, which I really love, the analogy of the geopadic space could possibly be the space where you encounter the sweetness of trust and forgiveness, only then to return to be stripped away from these pleasures to encounter difference. It's a developmental logic. And we have to, I think virtue is very much related to a kind of, it's ironic, right? Virtue is like discipline, orient, constrain your desire. Okay. But then you get rewarded from this, right? This is part of the spiritual path. So I'm going a little bit beyond just mere virtue ethics a little bit here. But I think the analogy is very important to make because I think if people don't see the whole scope of this, is that eventually there is this kind of brutal turning where all the sweetness and the rewards may no longer come with the mere practice of your restraining and constraining of desire. And that's what you're actually preparing for. You're preparing for when the sweetness of the geopadic space evaporates and you are told to handle difference. So it's like a little child. You need all the love and attachment to give yourself confidence to move. But then the parents leave and you have to mature yourself in this space alone. because when you encounter difference, it's going to feel like you're very much alone. I think. I could be wrong, but I feel like it's a very isolating experience when you encounter difference. But we'll see. Jockey's got something
It's
to
not
say.
even we'll see. We already dealt with it in the
Yeah.
sense of like what I mean by that. So 2 notes. One was that, and I think so Javier and me were talking about this, and sure, I think Daniel and Michelle would probably agree with this point, even though I don't think I talked with them directly about it yet. The problem, the great excitement of this language is revealing the Geopadia, that this has been is here, it's been here, and we can actually orient our lives more towards it in a way and actually redeem the algorithmic. But what's up is Paul coming in the scene? Yep, fall time to eat. The danger is that in those spaces of the Geopadia, to be legitimate and not a nice to have, I remember Daniel talking about this, when that encounter of difference shows up, it's 10 times more dangerous, because now it doesn't have all the buffers and safeguarding that the algorithmic gives you. The reason why people use the algorithmic is because they're too scared, like the real damage and harm of true vulnerability and betrayal and harm. It's really true. And it's actually in the encounter of the Geopadia and the failure to encounter that difference adequately, that what virtue demands of us is that's what it demands of us. We fail, we'll turn algorithmic, and it'll be 10 times worse. It's actually, as I said with Javier, traditionally, goodness and evil have been set as the contraries, when that's not even appropriate technically from Aristotle, because calculus is bad. It's not really technically evil. It's actually much more properly appropriate the way we're talking about this. If we think the Geopadia is the encounter of the beautiful, or an aspect of it, that it's beauty and evil actually are much more proper, contrary to each other under this way. So, and thus the greatest high, it gives you the opportunity for the greatest low. And that's the example of it. And it did happen. There was a moment, I actually remember this. So we didn't, no one's really talked about this in Stumping Ground, but at the end, people were weeping. People in the ending of that conference were in full weeping. I've been in many conferences. I've never been to one where people are all ones crying and giving testimonies of like eulogy. It felt like basically everyone was giving a eulogy to Socrates himself. Like if Socrates as the paradigma of philosophy was in the room, everybody was giving this basically these eulogies of prayer to his passing away in the moment as Stumping Ground was ending. Everyone's crying, they're hugging. Great unity, absolute unity was occurred in that moment. Then in the discourse that occurred afterwards, people were like, because I was a participant in this event with another individual, there was this moment of like, both of us disclosed to each other a real difference from our positions. And then I was like, oh, a difference was presented. I want to encounter it. It was discussed, but then it was moved forward as a line of inquiry of thought that was abstracted. But I was like, no, I want to know this person. Like, I want to know this person and what they're feeling, what's going on here. So I circled back. I remember making that choice. I wanted to circle back and I wanted to encounter the person and the difference. And then when I did that, it led to then a chain reaction that spiraled out of control. And it basically required me to do an exit on the spot. And it polarized the entire space for about a solid couple hours, I would say. And it put a real damper, or not damper, but like it put a real moment of criticalness in the entire event. Because now, this is actually the true moment of difference that occurred. Now it's stabilized, thank God, but that was because of the virtue of the individuals involved. If there was no virtue in the individuals involved, that's it. That would have exploded, would have been a decision to exit and never come back again. So, Javier, your point is right on the money of the Dark Night of the Soul, that the spiritual cookies, as this discussion said sometimes, is going to eventually be withdrawn, and now it becomes a real test of virtue. The great virtue is a contest to be won, and it's in the great contests of life, in those critical moments of inflection, is where we find out where the Geopadia will relate to algorithms. Because and that's the issue, is that when we open up this space, and this is what Javier point, when virtue gets presented to you and you take it legitimate, what it's trying to tell you, and you want to go down this path, there's going to come a moment of critical impasse, of real question, that it cannot be delegated, cannot be deferred. It is up to you and you alone and how you respond that will give you the answer. Are you truly worthy of virtue or not? And you might actually fail. It's a real possibility. Just like, guess what? Real love is a real possibility of failure. Great relationships, nation states, the political nation state to actually sustain itself will the moment of critical potential failure. And we've had it. Guys, there was I believe MacArthur, there was a real talk that he was going to march on Washington and take over the presidency at the time. There was real talk of that. People really believe that because there's huge, like when MacArthur was dismissed from the Korean War, that was a serious inflection point because we have the military that had the leader being dismissed by the president. And there was a real question that he was going to come in and actually like cause a coup, basically. There's actually real talk. Robert Caro talks about this in his literature, The Power Broker. Not Power Broker, excuse me, the Life of Lyndon Johnson. Like he's a huge anthology about this, talking about the history of the United States. Another famous example, when Andrew Johnson was impeached, a real question of the nature of the Constitution was a critical moments. These critical moments of people making decisions really matter. Cannot be delegated, cannot be deferred. These are the questions of when the spaces become geopitic or not. So when we see it through this lens, we see this is a huge challenge. It's not just a nice to talk about, it's actually a very critical question that if you actually talk about this, there's a real tension, a real something at stake at play. I think it's worth it because I love the geopitic. I think my life's worth living because of this. But because my life's worth living, we got to go through the process. And it's a real question, and people are going to be willing to go through that and succeed when they may really fail. And then the mess gets cleaned up by algorithms, and that's people's lives are going to be based on that.
Yeah, guys, this was wonderful. Super amazing. Super, 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 super important what you guys are talking about. Because the geopitic can be so sweet and so good. And it's always the best of all things that can become the worst of all things. But it depends on how you handle it and what you do with that. I don't think that's like to lose faith in it though. To me, it's actually important for why it does matter because well, I mean, I guess you could, again, like you're saying, Jockin, you can choose if you don't want to have the possibility of what I would say is in line with beauty, then you can choose that, you can, or you could choose the path that is, an attempt, like you're talking about, Javier, about just trying, right? Just trying, actually being open to try, that could lead to that experience of beauty, that does come with a risk. It's extremely dangerous, but it's also extremely wonderful, extremely beautiful, and worthwhile. So yeah, guys, I'm probably gonna have to hop off. This has been so wonderful. I still have some notes I didn't get to, so I'll either bring it up in our chat or we'll have a round two. This was really delightful, and I so appreciate your guys' time and getting to flesh this out together. It was great. So thank you guys again so much, and yeah, hope you guys have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
You too.
Thank
All
you
right, take
guys.
care,
Bye,
guys.
Jockin. Bye, Javier.
Bye.